History loves to celebrate wealth. But what happens when one man becomes so rich that he literally breaks the global economy just by being generous? What happens when a single journey transforms not just one life, but reshapes the financial systems of 3 continents? This is the story of Mansa Musa, a West African emperor who possessed wealth so incomprehensible that modern billionaires look like pocket change in comparison. A man who controlled more gold than entire European kingdoms, yet chose to give it away by the handful on the streets of Cairo. A devout Muslim who built libraries and mosques, yet commanded armies that enslaved thousands. Here's the mind-bending fact that historians are still grappling with. When Mansa Musa died in 1337, he was worth the equivalent of 400 billion in today's money, making him possibly the wealthiest individual who ever lived. But wealth without wisdom destroys empires. Power without purpose corrupts souls. How does a relatively unknown prince from the African savannah become the economic force that medieval Europeans feared more than any army? How does one man's religious pilgrimage accidentally trigger a financial crisis that lasted for decades? This is the story of how faith, gold, and political genius combined to create a legend, and how that same combination nearly destroyed everything he built. Picture the world in 1324. Europe is struggling through the Dark Ages, still recovering from the Black Death. The Mongol Empire dominates Asia. The Byzantine Empire clings to Constantinople. But in West Africa, something extraordinary is happening. The Mali Empire stretches across an area larger than Western Europe, controlling the trade routes that carry gold from the bambuk mines to the salt deposits of the Sahara. Here, in the cities of Timbuktu and Gao, Islamic scholars debate philosophy, while merchants count fortunes in gold dust. Libraries hold more books than most European cities, and universities attract students from across the known world. Into this golden age steps Mansa Musa, literally King Moses, ruler of what may have been the most prosperous empire of the medieval world. But his story isn't just about African achievement. It's about how one man's spiritual journey exposed the interconnected nature of medieval global economics, revealing trade networks that linked Spain to Indonesia, and showing European powers that the real center of world wealth lay not in Rome or Constantinople, but in the heart of Africa. The year is 1324, and Mansa Musa makes a decision that will echo through history. Islamic law requires every able-bodied Muslim to complete the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in their lifetime. For most people, this means a lifetime of saving, dangerous travel, and spiritual preparation. For the richest man in the world, it means something entirely different. It means the greatest display of wealth the medieval world had ever witnessed. But Musa doesn't know that his act of devotion will accidentally become an act of economic warfare. He doesn't realize that his journey will put Africa on every world map drawn for the next 2 centuries. And he certainly doesn't understand that the generosity he shows to demonstrate his faith will destabilize the gold markets from Spain to India. What begins as a spiritual quest becomes a geopolitical earthquake. The man who set out to honor God will return home to find that the world now knows his name and wants his gold. Mansa Musa wasn't born to rule the world's richest empire. Around 1280, he entered a world where he was merely one prince among many in the royal court of Mali. His predecessor, Abu Bakr II, had become obsessed with exploring the Atlantic Ocean, convinced that vast lands lay beyond the western horizon. In 1312, Abu Bakr assembled a massive fleet, some accounts suggest 2,000 ships, and sailed into the Atlantic, never to return. This maritime disaster left a power vacuum that Musa stepped into with calculated precision. But inheriting the throne of Mali wasn't like inheriting a European kingdom. Mali's wealth came from controlling something more valuable than armies: trade routes. The empire sat at the intersection of the trans-Saharan trade network, where salt from northern mines met gold from southern rivers. Musa understood that controlling this intersection meant controlling the flow of wealth across half the world. Picture yourself standing in Timbuktu during Musa's early reign. The air buzzes with languages: Arabic, Mandinka, Berber, Songhai. Caravans arrive daily from North Africa, loaded with horses, copper, and manufactured goods. They leave carrying gold, ivory, and slaves. In the markets, a pound of salt trades for a pound of gold, a ratio that makes merchants from Cairo weep with joy. This was the economic engine that Musa inherited, but he would transform it into something unprecedented. Musa's first challenge came not from external enemies, but from the complex internal politics of the Mandinka people. Mali wasn't a centralized state like medieval France. It was a confederation of kingdoms, city-states, and tribal territories united under the Mansa's authority. Each region maintained its own customs, languages, and local rulers. Holding this diverse empire together required more than military might. It demanded diplomatic brilliance. Musa's solution was revolutionary. He would use Islam not as a tool of conversion, but as a language of commerce and administration. While he remained personally devout, he allowed local traditions to flourish alongside Islamic practices. His courts spoke Arabic for international diplomacy, but governed in local languages. His armies included both Muslim cavalry and traditional Mandinka warriors. This religious pragmatism created stability in a region where cultural conflicts could tear empires apart. But Musa's true genius lay in his understanding of wealth creation. Previous rulers had simply collected tributes and taxes. Musa invested in infrastructure. He built roads connecting remote gold mines to major trading centers. He established rest stops with fresh water for trans-Saharan caravans. He created a standardized system of weights and measures that made trade more efficient. Most importantly, he built relationships with Berber merchants who controlled the northern trade routes, turning potential rivals into dependent partners. By 1320, Musa controlled gold production from regions that modern geologists estimate contained some of the richest deposits in Africa. The Bambuk gold fields alone produced several tons of gold annually, wealth that flowed directly through territories under his control. But gold was just the beginning. Mali also controlled the salt mines of Tagaza, where massive blocks of salt were cut from underground deposits and carried south on camel caravans. Here's what made Musa extraordinary. He understood that controlling supply wasn't enough. He needed to control demand. Salt was essential for food preservation in tropical climates, making it literally worth its weight in gold to southern African kingdoms. Meanwhile, gold was increasingly important for the Islamic world's expanding monetary systems. Musa positioned himself at the center of both markets. The numbers are staggering. Conservative estimates suggest that during Musa's reign, Mali controlled approximately 15 tons of gold production annually, roughly equivalent to modern small nation-states. But unlike modern mining operations, this gold came from alluvial deposits that required minimal technological infrastructure. Skilled miners would pan gold dust from riverbeds, creating wealth with techniques that had remained unchanged for centuries. Despite his material success, Musa remained deeply committed to his Islamic faith. He built mosques throughout his empire, invited Islamic scholars to his court, and established Quranic schools in major cities. But his religion wasn't merely personal, it was strategic. Islam provided a shared identity that helped unite his diverse empire, and Islamic law offered sophisticated frameworks for commercial agreements and international diplomacy. Musa's daily routine reflected his dual nature as warrior king and devout believer. He began each day with morning prayers, followed by audiences with local governors and foreign ambassadors. He studied Arabic poetry and Islamic jurisprudence, but also reviewed military reports and trade statistics. His palace library contained works by Ibn Sina and al-Ghazali, alongside genealogical records of Mandinka clans and detailed maps of gold-producing regions. This spiritual dimension of his character would prove crucial to everything that followed. For Musa, the Hajj pilgrimage wasn't optional. It was a religious obligation that no amount of political inconvenience could postpone. The decision to undertake the journey would transform him from a regional African ruler into a figure of global historical significance. In 1323, Musa announced his intention to complete the Hajj. His advisors were horrified. The journey would require traveling through potentially hostile territories, crossing the Sahara Desert, and navigating the complex political relationships of Islamic North Africa and the Middle East. More importantly, it would require the Mansa to leave his empire for nearly 2 years, an unprecedented risk in a political system that depended on personal relationships and direct authority. But Musa had already made his calculations. His empire was stable, his governors were loyal, and his military was strong enough to maintain order in his absence. More importantly, he saw the pilgrimage as an opportunity to announce Mali's presence on the world stage. He would travel not as a petitioner seeking legitimacy, but as an equal among the great rulers of the Islamic world. The preparations took months. Musa assembled an entourage that reflected Mali's wealth and power. 60,000 people, including soldiers, servants, scholars, and merchants. He brought 80 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust. He included hundreds of slaves who would be freed and given gold as acts of charity along the route. Most audaciously, he carried 500 servants, each bearing a staff made of pure gold weighing 4 pounds. As news of these preparations spread through trading networks, merchants and rulers from Morocco to Iraq began making their own plans. The richest man in the world was coming to town. Picture the scene as Mansa Musa's caravan departed from Niani, his capital city, in early 1324. 60,000 people stretched across miles of savanna, a moving city that consumed tons of food and water daily. The logistics were staggering. Advanced scouts secured water sources, quartermasters distributed supplies, and military commanders maintained security. This wasn't just a pilgrimage. It was the medieval world's most extravagant demonstration of organizational capability. The first phase of the journey took the caravan north through the Sahara Desert, following trade routes that Musa's merchants knew intimately. But even experienced travelers had never seen anything like this procession. Each evening, the caravan would establish a temporary city, complete with designated quarters for different social groups, markets for trading with local populations, and mosque areas for prayer. Musa traveled in a pavilion of silk and gold, but he walked alongside his people during religious observances, demonstrating the Islamic principle that all believers are equal before God. As they crossed into North Africa, word of the caravan's approach spread faster than the caravan itself. Local rulers faced a diplomatic crisis. How do you host the richest man in the world? The traditional gifts and entertainments offered to visiting dignitaries seemed pathetically inadequate when your guest arrives with more gold than your entire kingdom has ever possessed. After months of desert travel, Musa's caravan approached Cairo in July 1324. The Mamluk Sultanate, which controlled Egypt, was one of the most powerful Muslim states of the era. Its rulers considered themselves equals to the Abbasid caliphs and the Ottoman sultans, but nothing had prepared them for Mansa Musa. Al-Umari, a contemporary historian, described the scene. This man flooded Cairo with his benefactions. He left no court emir nor holder of a royal office without the gift of a load of gold. The Cairenes made incalculable profits out of him and his suite in buying and selling and taking and giving. They exchanged gold until they depressed its value in Egypt and caused it to fall in price. But Musa's generosity created an unexpected diplomatic crisis. According to Islamic protocol, visiting rulers were expected to prostrate themselves before the Sultan as a sign of respect. Musa refused. He was a sovereign king, he argued, and would bow only to Allah. The standoff lasted for days, with Egyptian court officials growing increasingly nervous about how to handle this wealthy but stubborn visitor. The compromise they reached reveals Musa's political sophistication. He agreed to bow toward the Sultan, but claimed he was actually bowing toward Mecca for his daily prayers. The Sultan saved face by accepting this fiction, while Musa maintained his dignity without explicitly violating Islamic protocol. Both rulers understood they were performing for an audience of international merchants and diplomats who would carry news of this encounter across the known world. What happened next demonstrates how individual actions can have unintended global consequences. Musa spent 3 months in Cairo, and during that time, he gave away so much gold that he fundamentally disrupted the local economy. He distributed gold to scholars, poor citizens, government officials, and random strangers he encountered on the streets. He purchased supplies for his journey at prices far above market rates. He commissioned architectural projects and sponsored religious celebrations. The immediate effects were dramatic. With so much additional gold circulating in Cairo's markets, the value of gold relative to other commodities plummeted. Merchants who had accepted gold payments early in Musa's visit found themselves holding currency that was worth significantly less by the time he left. The exchange rate between gold and silver shifted so dramatically that it affected trade relationships throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. But here's what makes this truly remarkable. These effects lasted for more than a decade. Al-Makrizi, writing nearly a century later, reported that gold remained depressed in Cairo for 12 years after Musa's visit. This wasn't just local economic disruption, it was macroeconomic policy implemented by one individual's generosity. Modern economists studying this episode have identified it as one of history's clearest examples of how monetary policy affects international trade. Musa's gold distribution essentially implemented quantitative easing in medieval Egypt, increasing liquidity in ways that affected commodity prices, exchange rates, and trade balances across multiple countries. Musa's time in Cairo accomplished something unprecedented. It forced the Islamic world to recognize sub-Saharan Africa as a source of wealth and power rather than merely a supplier of slaves and exotic goods. Egyptian chroniclers described Mali in terms usually reserved for major powers like the Byzantine Empire or the Mongol Khanates. They documented Musa's military strength, his empire's geographical extent, and his sophisticated understanding of Islamic law and Arabic literature. This recognition had immediate practical consequences. Berber merchants, who had previously viewed trade with West Africa as profitable but peripheral, began treating it as essential to their business strategies. North African rulers started sending diplomatic missions to Mali, seeking trade agreements and military alliances. Islamic scholars began studying West African intellectual traditions alongside those of Baghdad and Cordoba. Perhaps most importantly, Musa's demonstration of wealth and sophistication challenged prevalent stereotypes about African capabilities. Medieval Islamic literature often portrayed sub-Saharan Africa as primitive and backward, assumptions that justified the slave trade and limited diplomatic engagement. Musa's presence in Cairo, speaking fluent Arabic, debating fine points of Islamic jurisprudence, and casually distributing fortunes in gold, forced educated Muslims to reconsider their understanding of African civilization. After his extended stay in Cairo, Musa continued to Mecca to complete his Hajj obligations. The pilgrimage itself was relatively uneventful. By Islamic law, all pilgrims are equals during the Hajj, regardless of wealth or political status. But even here, Musa's wealth created complications. Traditional Hajj practices included purchasing sacrificial animals and giving charity to poor pilgrims. When the richest man in the world participates in these rituals, the economic effects ripple throughout the local economy. More importantly, The Hajj allowed Musa to network with Muslim rulers and merchants from across the Islamic world. He met representatives from the Mongol Ilkhanate, the Delhi Sultanate, the Ottoman Empire, and various Central Asian kingdoms. These conversations weren't just diplomatic pleasantries, they were business meetings that would reshape trade relationships for decades. Musa used his time in Mecca to study Islamic architecture and urban planning. He commissioned detailed drawings of the city's layout and interviewed engineers about construction techniques. These weren't tourist souvenirs. They were research materials for the building projects he planned to implement in Mali upon his return. The journey home nearly ended in disaster. Musa had been so generous during his outbound journey that his caravan was running low on funds. In a moment that reveals both his practical intelligence and his understanding of medieval economics, Musa approached Cairene merchants to request loans at interest rates that would have been considered usurious in normal circumstances. This episode demonstrates the sophistication of medieval Islamic banking. Musa negotiated complex financial arrangements that allowed him to borrow against future gold shipments from Mali. Egyptian merchants, despite their recent experience with Musa's economic disruption, were eager to establish long-term trading relationships with the world's richest ruler. The loans were structured as trade agreements rather than simple debt, allowing both parties to avoid Islamic prohibitions against charging interest. But the real significance of these financial arrangements lay in what they represented: the integration of West African wealth into international Islamic banking systems. Musa's loans created ongoing relationships that would channel African gold into Middle Eastern and North African markets for generations. By the time Musa returned to Mali in 1325, his journey had transformed him from a regional African ruler into a global celebrity. European maps began including detailed representations of Mali, often showing Musa as a crowned figure holding gold nuggets. The famous Catalan Atlas of 1375, created for the King of France, depicts Musa as one of the most important rulers in the world, equal in status to European kings and Asian emperors. But fame came with challenges. Other African rulers, envious of Mali's newfound international recognition, began forming alliances against Musa's empire. Berber tribes that had previously avoided conflict with Mali started launching raids against border territories, hoping to capture some of the wealth that had made Musa famous. European merchants began arriving in North Africa, specifically seeking trade routes to Mali, creating new commercial pressures and diplomatic complications. Musa's response to these challenges revealed the strategic thinking that had made him wealthy in the first place. Instead of viewing increased attention as a threat, he treated it as an opportunity for expansion. He began planning architectural projects that would physically demonstrate Mali's sophistication to foreign visitors. He expanded his diplomatic corps to manage relationships with the growing number of countries that wanted trade agreements with Mali. Most importantly, he started using his international fame as leverage in regional African politics. Musa returned to Mali to discover that his spectacular journey had created unexpected problems at home. His prolonged absence had destabilized the delicate balance of regional politics that held the empire together. Local governors had grown accustomed to operating independently, making decisions without consulting the central authority. Some had begun collecting taxes for their own treasuries rather than forwarding them to the capital. More troubling, Musa's international fame had attracted unwanted attention from neighboring kingdoms. The Mossi people, traditional enemies of Mali, had formed new alliances with Songhai rulers who resented Mali's dominance of Niger River trade routes. These coalitions weren't strong enough to threaten Mali directly, but they could disrupt the commercial networks that generated the empire's wealth. Musa faced a cruel irony. His demonstration of Mali's wealth and power had made his empire less secure. Every neighboring ruler now knew exactly how much wealth Mali controlled, creating incentives for military adventures that might have seemed pointless when Mali's resources were less well known. His generosity in Cairo had inadvertently painted a target on his empire's back. Determined to solidify Mali's reputation as a center of Islamic civilization, Musa embarked on an ambitious building campaign that would consume enormous resources and reshape the physical landscape of West Africa. His most famous project was the Gingereber Mosque in Timbuktu, designed by the Andalusian architect Abu Ishaq as-Sahili, whom Musa had convinced to relocate from Granada. The mosque represented more than architectural ambition. It was a statement about Mali's place in the Islamic world. Built from mud brick and timber, it demonstrated that sophisticated Islamic architecture could be adapted to West African materials and climate conditions. The mosque's distinctive tower, or minaret, became a symbol that appeared on European maps for centuries, marking Timbuktu as a center of learning and civilization. But Musa's building projects created enormous financial drains on the imperial treasury. Each construction project required importing specialized craftsmen, purchasing expensive materials, and maintaining large workforces. The Sankore University complex alone employed hundreds of Islamic scholars, copyists, and administrators. While these projects enhanced Mali's international reputation, they also represented massive ongoing expenses that had to be funded from gold production and trade revenues. As Musa aged, questions about succession began creating political instability throughout the empire. The Mandinka system of kingship didn't follow European primogeniture rules. Succession could pass to brothers, sons, or other relatives based on complex criteria, including military capability, diplomatic skill, and religious devotion. Musa had multiple potential heirs, each with legitimate claims and their own bases of support. The succession uncertainty was particularly problematic because Mali's stability depended on personal relationships between the Mansa and regional governors. Local rulers who had sworn loyalty to Musa weren't automatically bound to his successor, especially if that successor lacked Musa's proven combination of wealth, military success, and international recognition. Musa attempted to address this problem by gradually transferring responsibilities to his chosen successor, his son Magan. But Magan lacked his father's charisma and strategic vision. Where Musa had built relationships through careful diplomacy and generous gift-giving, Magan relied on inherited authority and bureaucratic procedures. This approach worked in peacetime but proved inadequate when challenged by external threats or internal disputes. Perhaps most significantly, Musa's lavish spending had begun to strain even Mali's enormous gold resources. The Hajj journey had cost the equivalent of several years' worth of gold production. The building projects required ongoing expenditures that competed with military spending and administrative costs. The expanded diplomatic corps, the enlarged court, and the various scholarly institutions all represented permanent additions to the imperial budget. Mali's economy was fundamentally extractive. It depended on controlling gold production and taxing trade routes, rather than developing diversified economic activities. While this model had generated enormous wealth during periods of political stability, it was vulnerable to disruptions in gold production or shifts in trade patterns. Musa's successors would inherit an empire with higher expenses but not necessarily higher revenues. Musa spent his final years attempting to consolidate his achievements and prepare Mali for the challenges that would follow his death. He negotiated border agreements with neighboring kingdoms, hoping to reduce military tensions that might flare up during a succession transition. He established detailed administrative procedures for managing trade relationships and collecting taxes, trying to institutionalize the personal relationships that had made his reign successful. But he also struggled with the contradictions inherent in his empire's structure. Mali's wealth depended on controlling trade in slaves, gold, and salt, activities that generated enormous profits but also created moral tensions with Islamic teachings about social justice and human dignity. Musa had always navigated these contradictions through personal charisma and strategic generosity, but he couldn't guarantee that his successors would possess the same abilities. His death in 1337 marked the end of Mali's golden age in more ways than one. While the empire continued to exist for another century, it never again achieved the combination of military power, economic dominance, and international recognition that had characterized Musa's reign. The man who had accidentally triggered an international economic crisis through his generosity left behind an empire that would struggle to maintain the very wealth that had made him famous. When Mansa Musa died in 1337, his passing sent ripples through international markets that had grown accustomed to Mali's gold supplies. European merchants who had established relationships with Malian traders found themselves scrambling to maintain those connections under new leadership. North African kingdoms that had negotiated trade agreements with Musa discovered that his successors lacked both his diplomatic skills and his willingness to use gold as a tool of international relations. Maghan, Musa's son and chosen successor, ruled for only 4 years before dying in 1341. His brief reign was marked by rebellions in outlying provinces and the loss of several important territories, including Timbuktu, which was conquered by the Tuareg. The empire that Musa had held together through personal relationships and strategic generosity began fragmenting under leaders who possessed his authority but not his capabilities. Mansa Musa's legacy extends far beyond his personal wealth, or even the Mali Empire. His Hajj pilgrimage fundamentally changed how medieval Europeans and Muslims understood the geography of wealth and power. Before 1324, most world maps depicted Africa as a peripheral continent inhabited by primitive peoples. After Musa's journey, Africa appeared on maps as the home of sophisticated kingdoms and enormous riches. The Catalan Atlas of 1375, created 50 years after Musa's death, shows him seated on a throne, holding a golden orb. With the inscription, "This Negro lord is called Musa Mali, Lord of the Negroes of Guinea." So abundant is the gold which is found in his country that he is the richest and most noble king in all the land. This representation influenced European attitudes toward Africa for centuries, contributing to the age of exploration as European powers sought to establish direct trade relationships with African gold producers. More subtly, Musa's story demonstrates the interconnected nature of medieval global economics in ways that challenge traditional narratives about European dominance. The gold that funded the Italian Renaissance, the spices that motivated Portuguese exploration, and the silver that financed Spanish colonial expansion all moved through trading, networks that had been reshaped by one African ruler's religious pilgrimage. Modern assessments of Mansa Musa must grapple with the moral contradictions inherent in his empire's wealth. Mali's prosperity depended significantly on controlling trade in enslaved humans, a reality that complicates any simple celebration of African achievement. Musa's own caravan included slaves, and his empire's economy relied on slave labor in gold mines and agricultural production. Yet, judging medieval African slavery by modern standards requires acknowledging similar contradictions in contemporary Islamic and European societies. The wealth that funded Musa's architectural projects and scholarly institutions came from the same sources that funded libraries in Cairo, mosques in Cordoba, and universities in Paris. The difference wasn't moral superiority, but rather access to resources and strategic positioning within global trade networks. What distinguishes Musa is not the absence of moral complexity, but rather his sophisticated understanding of how to leverage wealth for political and cultural influence. He used gold not just to purchase goods or hire armies, but to build relationships, establish legitimacy, and create lasting institutional changes that outlived his personal rule. Mansa Musa's story offers several lessons that remain relevant in our contemporary global economy. His understanding that controlling supply chains matters more than controlling production anticipates modern concerns about economic dependency and resource extraction. His use of soft power, cultural influence, educational investment, and strategic generosity to build international relationships parallels contemporary approaches to international development and diplomacy. Perhaps most importantly, his accidental disruption of international gold markets demonstrates how individual actions can have unintended systemic consequences in interconnected economic systems. Just as Musa's generosity in Cairo affected trade relationships from Spain to India, modern economic decisions in major financial centers can trigger consequences in distant markets that decision-makers never intended or anticipated. His story also illustrates the complex relationship between wealth and power in global contexts. Musa possessed more personal wealth than most European kingdoms, but Mali remained peripheral to the major military and technological developments of his era. Wealth alone wasn't sufficient to guarantee long-term political influence or cultural impact. Despite extensive historical research, significant questions about Mansa Musa's life and reign remain unanswered. How exactly did Mali's gold production and distribution systems operate? What specific diplomatic agreements did Musa negotiate during his time in Cairo and Mecca? How did his architectural projects influence later West African building traditions? These gaps in our knowledge reflect broader problems with medieval African historical sources. Much of what we know about Musa comes from Arabic chroniclers who emphasized his wealth and religious devotion but paid less attention to the administrative and military systems that made his empire function. European sources from the same period offer detailed information about trade goods and exchange rates, but little insight into political structures or cultural practices. Recent archaeological work in Mali and neighboring countries is beginning to fill some of these gaps, revealing sophisticated urban planning, complex metallurgical techniques, and extensive trade networks that support historical accounts of Mali's wealth and power. But much remains to be discovered about how ordinary people lived in Musa's empire and how his policies affected daily life beyond the royal court and major trading centers. Why does Mansa Musa's story continue to captivate modern audiences? Perhaps because it challenges comfortable assumptions about medieval history, African capabilities, and the relationship between wealth and wisdom. His journey from regional African ruler to global celebrity happened not through military conquest or technological innovation, but through the simple act of living his religious convictions on an unprecedented scale. In an era when we're constantly reminded of the interconnected nature of global economics, Musa's story offers a medieval precedent for how individual actions can have worldwide consequences. His pilgrimage demonstrates that globalization isn't a modern phenomenon. It's a recurring pattern in human history that takes different forms but produces similar outcomes: unexpected connections, unintended consequences, and the gradual recognition that distant events can affect local realities in profound ways. What would you have done in Mansa Musa's position? Faced with enormous wealth, religious obligations, and political responsibilities, how would you balance personal faith with imperial necessity? Would you risk destabilizing your empire for the sake of spiritual fulfillment? Would you use your wealth to build relationships or accumulate power? These questions matter because Musa's choices reveal something fundamental about leadership in complex societies. He understood that true power comes not from hoarding resources, but from using them strategically to build relationships, establish legitimacy, and create lasting institutions. His legacy suggests that the most effective leaders are those who can balance immediate practical concerns with long-term vision, personal conviction with political pragmatism. Mansa Musa died nearly 700 years ago, but his story continues to resonate because it captures something timeless about human ambition, spiritual conviction, and the unintended consequences of living your values on a grand scale. He set out to honor his God and accidentally rewrote world history. In doing so, he created a legacy that reminds us that individual choices matter. that wealth without wisdom is meaningless, and that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply to be generous. What's your take on Mansa Musa's legacy? Was he a visionary leader who used his wealth to elevate African civilization? Or was he a fortunate ruler who happened to control vast resources during a period of global economic expansion? How do we balance admiration for his achievements with recognition of the moral contradictions inherent in his empire's wealth? Share your thoughts, because understanding how we judge historical figures reveals as much about our own values as it does about theirs. If this incredible story of wealth, faith, and unintended consequences amazes you, there are countless other forgotten figures whose decisions shaped our world in ways we're still discovering. Subscribe to explore more hidden histories that challenge everything you thought you knew about the past.